Folks around these parts say the wind carries secrets out here in Cimarron County, and I reckon I learned that true one August night when the air was thick as molasses and the wheat fields rustled like they were breathing. I'm Kyle, been hauling hay and fixing fences since I dropped out of high school, and though life's quiet, I've always liked how the land talks to you if you know how to listen. My place sits about 5 miles off the main road, down a dirt track nobody bothers with unless they're lost or hunting. Nights can feel endless out here, with the sky lit up by stars so close they seem to whisper your name. I usually drive into Boise City for supplies and head back before dusk, but that day I'd stayed too late jawing with a buddy about coyotes raiding his chicken coop. I didn't think much of hitting the road after dark, figuring I'd done it 100 times before without trouble. But as soon as my tires hit that dusty lane, it felt like the shadows were watching me breathe. I'd just passed the old rusted-out grain silo when I heard a noise off in the scrub. Something like a woman crying soft, then hiccuping like she couldn't catch her breath. My headlights didn't reach far, so I slowed down, thinking maybe some poor soul was stranded or hurt. I'm the kind of fellow who can't just drive off and leave someone in a bind, no matter how late the hour. So I rolled my window down, called out a couple times, and that's when the crying stopped altogether, leaving only the wind and the insects buzzing like static in my ears. I tried shining my flashlight out the truck window, but the beam just bounced off the swirling dust and made it look like tiny stars were trapped in a jar. That's when I started feeling like something was all wrong, like the world had sucked in a deep breath and was waiting to exhale. I killed the engine and stepped out, my boots crunching in the gravel, and that's when I saw it. A shape crouched low by the mesquite, glowing eyes catching the beam of my light. At first I thought it was a cougar, the way it moved low and smooth, muscles rippling under its tawny coat. But then it stood taller than it should have, and its outlines seemed to swell and shrink like heat waves off the asphalt. I swear it looked at me like it knew my whole history, like it was weighing me for something more than just prey. My heart slammed in my chest so hard it felt like it might bust a rib, and I nearly called out again, but the sound died in my throat. The thing made a low rumbling noise, almost a growl but somehow softer, like a warning mixed with curiosity. I kept thinking of stories folks tell about skinwalkers or ghosts out in the prairie, even though I don't believe in such things. Suddenly, it turned and bounded away with a cat's grace, leaving a swirl of dust and mesquite pods tumbling in its wake. I stood there a minute, half expecting it to circle back and charge me. But when I followed the tracks the next day, they were ordinary cougar prints leading off into the sagebrush, though spaced farther apart than any normal stride. Part of me figured it was just my eyes playing tricks in the dark, mixing fear and shadows into monsters. But even knowing it was a cougar, I can't shake the way its shape seemed to flicker and stretch under my light, or how those eyes seemed almost human for a breath. It's enough to make a man question how well he knows these lands he's called home all his life. Nowadays, I keep my trips shorter after sundown and carry an extra lantern in the cab, just in case I ever hear that crying again drifting out of the mesquite. Folks may laugh and say it was nothing but a big cat, but I know what I saw, or what I thought I saw, and it still creeps into my dreams some nights when the wind howls through the wheat. To this day, I'm not sure if the creature was flesh and blood or something older, something hiding behind the shape of an animal. Anyway, let's go to the next one. It was late October, the kind of Oklahoma evening when the sun sinks fast and the cotton fields turn the color of tarnished silver, and I'd been out past dusk trying to fix a cracked irrigation pipe along the edge of my land near Woodward. Folks around here call me Dolores, or just D. And since my husband passed 5 years back, it's been me running the pecan farm, patching up equipment, and making sure the bills get paid, even if I gotta hustle pecans at roadside stands come harvest. I've grown used to working alone, and to the hush that creeps in once the tractors go silent, and the wind starts telling secrets across the fields. That night, though, the quiet felt thicker somehow, like the air itself was hiding something, and I remember feeling uneasy even before I got in my truck. I tossed my wrench on the seat, wiped the dirt off my hands, and stared out at the rows of trees silhouetted black against the purple sky. There was a smell on the breeze, dust, dry leaves, and something faintly sweet, like wild sage or old honeycomb. I told myself it was nothing, just autumn settling in, but my pulse was already thumping like a drum. I started the engine and rolled slow down the dirt lane, headlights casting long beams across the ruts and broken grass. About halfway to the county road, I saw movement near a stand of cottonwoods off to my left. Quick shapes darting low, faster than deer usually move. Shadows that seemed to lengthen and twist even when they should have been shrinking under the lights. I eased off the gas, my foot hovering over the brake, and tried to convince myself it was just a small herd of deer. Deer don't slither, and whatever I was looking at seemed to hug the ground, their bodies flowing like water between the tree trunks. I rolled the window down an inch, hoping to hear hooves or rustling, but the only sound was the dry whisper of leaves brushing together. My scalp crawled under my ball cap, and for a second I had the strongest urge to turn around and leave the way I'd come. But stubbornness is as much a part of me as the red dirt under my nails, so I stayed put, watching. That's when one of them stepped into my headlights proper, and my breath locked up in my chest. It looked like a coyote in shape, with a narrow snout and pointed ears. But it was taller, lanky as a colt, its legs too long and thin, joints bending sharper than they ought to. Its fur shone slick, almost greasy, catching the light in a way that made it look wet, and its eyes flashed bright yellow, round and unblinking like marbles. For a moment I swear it studied me, tilting its head the way a person does when they're trying to figure out if you're lying. Behind it, 2 more slid into view, same tall, raw-boned look, moving in a kind of silent synchrony that made my skin pebble up. I opened my door halfway, meaning to shout and scare them off, but not a sound came out of my throat. The air felt too tight, as if the space between me and those creatures was bending somehow, like heat rising off an asphalt road. All at once, the lead animal lowered itself, almost flattening to its belly, and slithered backward into the darkness, followed by the other 2, leaving the cottonwoods trembling like they'd just been slapped by wind. I jumped out, shone my flashlight into the undergrowth, but the beam only bounced off the dust and twisted shadows, making shapes that seemed to breathe and stretch. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the light steady, and I kept expecting to see those yellow eyes staring back. When the silence finally settled again, I felt like the whole prairie was leaning in close, listening to me breathe. I wanted to blame it on my imagination, or tricks of the dark, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that those things had been something more than just animals. The way they moved, the way they watched me, it was like they were waiting for me to come closer, to step into the trees. Next morning I went back out there, determined to prove to myself it was nothing but regular wildlife. But the ground under the cottonwoods was untouched, except for fallen leaves and the scent of earth. No paw prints, no broken branches, no sign of anything large passing through. I even brought out my neighbor Jed, who's hunted coyotes his whole life, and he said maybe they were just lean animals looking odd from a dry season, but I could see in his eyes he wasn't so sure. Since then I keep my distance from that grove after dark, and even during the day I feel like eyes are on me if I linger too long. Part of me wants to believe it was all just tricks of the light and fear mixing in my head, but I've lived too many years under these Oklahoma skies to ignore my gut. Now I just tell myself, some things out here are better left alone. Sometimes when the wind whistles through the pecan trees, I remember how those creatures moved like liquid shadow and stared at me like they knew my name. And this was nothing compared to the next tale. Some folks say it'll give you chills. Back in 1992, I was working as a lineman for the power company out of Ardmore, driving long stretches of county roads in every kind of weather, and I'd gotten used to seeing wildlife dart across the blacktop at night. My name's Clay, and I've always been more comfortable 30 feet up a pole than I am making small talk at church suppers. Nights on the job were nothing new for me, especially when storms would snap lines or lightning would knock transformers silly. That July, we'd been hit with a run of dry thunderstorms, clouds boiling over the plains but dropping almost no rain, so I was on patrol looking for hot spots or wires downed by wind. I was heading west, down an old service road past Lake Murray, around midnight, just me and the static crackle of the radio, when I saw something pale slip between the trees off my left side. I chalked it up to a stray dog, or even a cow loose from someone's pasture, though I slowed down all the same, instinct telling me to pay attention. About a mile on, the road narrowed between scrubby oaks and blackjack trees, and my headlights kept catching quick flashes of pale movement in the underbrush. It was the color that struck me first, a sort of bone white, almost glowing under the sodium light bouncing off my rig. I pulled over, killed the engine, and stepped out with my flashlight, figuring I'd get a look before calling animal control in case it was a sick animal or someone's spooked livestock. The air smelled sharp with ozone and dry dust, the wind rattling the leaves like paper bags. I swept my light side to side, half expecting to find a calf tangled in fence wire, but there was nothing except brush and the buzzing of cicadas so loud it almost drowned out my own breathing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched, like a weight pressing between my shoulders. Then, off to my right, a big shape stepped into view, just inside the tree line. It was a bobcat, or at least that's what my brain screamed at me to believe. But it was taller than any bobcat I'd ever seen, its back nearly reaching my chest. Its fur was the same pale, washed-out color I'd glimpsed earlier, and its eyes shone an eerie green under my flashlight. But what made my stomach twist was how it seemed to shimmer, like heat rising off a highway, its outline blurring and shifting as if it couldn't quite hold itself together. It blinked at me real slow, muscles tensing like it might spring, and in that instant, I'd have bet my last dollar it wasn't any animal born under normal stars. My mouth went dry, and for a long few seconds, all I could do was stare back, frozen by the sense that I'd just stepped into the wrong part of the night. Without a sound, it lowered its body and slipped sideways into the brush, branches barely stirring as it vanished. I rushed forward, trying to track it with my flashlight, but the trees swallowed the beam, and the buzzing of the cicadas felt suddenly deafening. I circled the spot, looking for prints or broken twigs, but found nothing except dust and the faint smell of something musky, like damp fur and old pennies. I kept telling myself it had to be a bobcat, suffering from some kind of illness, mange maybe. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. The size, the color, the way its shape seemed to waver, it all felt wrong, like the air itself was bending around it. I got back in my truck, locked the doors without thinking, and drove the rest of my shift with every hair on my neck standing up. Next day I called a buddy who traps bobcats sometimes, and he laughed and said maybe the heat was playing tricks on my eyes. But a week later, another crewman saw something pale cross the service road in the same spot, big as a wolf but moving silent as smoke. I've been back there dozens of times since and never saw it again. But every July when the dry storms roll in, I can't help remembering how that creature stared me down like it knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Now I always check my mirrors twice when driving those back roads at night. The next one will send chills down your spine. Last spring, up near the outskirts of Pahaska, I was finishing up a long shift at the diner where I wait tables 6 days a week, trying to keep the bills paid and save a little for nursing school. Folks call me Lacey, and I'm 28, born and raised right here in Osage County, where the sunsets look like spilled paint and the wind seems to sing old secrets through the prairie grass. It was nearly midnight when I locked up and headed for my beat-up Ford, the sky slick with stars and the air carrying the smell of damp earth from a thunderstorm that had rolled through earlier. I usually take the gravel back roads home, partly because it's faster and partly because I like the quiet. But that night the silence felt too thick, as though the whole world was holding its breath. My tires crunched over loose rock, and for a few miles it was just me and the hiss of the wind. I remember thinking how the shadows seemed to crowd closer than usual along the roadside ditches. About halfway home, I saw movement just beyond my headlights, something darting low along the fence line, pale as moonlight, and quicker than any coyote I'd ever seen. I slowed down, squinting through the windshield, and spotted it again, flickering between fence posts like a trick of the eye. I pulled over, curiosity getting the better of me, and rolled my window down to listen. The prairie was alive with frogs chirping from rain puddles and the distant hum of oil pumps creaking back and forth. But underneath all that, I heard this odd rustling, like someone dragging a stick through tall grass. Goosebumps rippled across my arms, and I told myself it was probably just a fox or a stray dog. Still, there was something about the way it moved that set my teeth on edge. Too smooth, too fast, like water sliding across glass. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, gravel shifting under my boots, and started toward the fence. That's when I finally saw it clearly. A large animal crouched low among the sagebrush, its body pale gray, almost bluish, and its eyes shining green like glass marbles caught in the beam of my light. At first I thought it was a big raccoon, or maybe a bobcat, but its shape was all wrong. Its limbs looked longer than they should have been, and its back seemed to ripple as though it was breathing heavy or trembling. It made this low, chuffing noise. Not quite a growl, more like a soft cough, and I could swear the sound carried something almost deliberate, like it was trying to communicate. I stood frozen, every part of me screaming to get back in my truck, but my feet stayed rooted, staring at those glassy eyes watching me as though measuring my next move. Then, in one smooth motion, it rose up higher than any bobcat I'd ever seen and turned away, gliding over the fence like it weighed nothing at all. The barbed wire didn't even twitch, and the creature vanished into the darkness so quickly it was like the grass swallowed it whole. I rushed over, aiming my flashlight at the spot, but found no tracks, no broken grass, nothing except the hush of the prairie settling back down. I stood there a long minute, breathing hard, waiting for it to reappear, half hoping it would so I'd know it was real. The wind picked up, carrying the damp smell of wet sage and dirt, and the moment felt like a thin line between ordinary and something I couldn't quite name. By the time I finally got back in my truck, my knees felt weak as paper. The next morning, I drove by in daylight and checked the fence for fur or prints, but there wasn't a sign of anything unusual. Part of me keeps trying to believe it was just a coyote catching the light weird, or maybe my tired eyes playing tricks after a long shift. But late at night, when I'm driving those same gravel roads, I can't shake the memory of that thing's eyes locked on mine, or the way its body seemed to shift and ripple like it was half made of shadows. Folks around here laugh when I tell the story, saying I've been working too many doubles at the diner. But I know what I saw, or at least, I know what I felt standing there under the stars. Anyway, let's go to the next one. People in these parts believe the salt flats up around Cherokee hold old secrets, and after what I saw last September, I'm starting to think they might be right. My name's Darnell, and I'm a mechanic by trade, 34 years old, been living all my life in Alfalfa County, where the roads run flat and the sky stretches so wide it makes you feel like an ant on a kitchen floor. That evening, I'd been working late on a rancher's F-250 that threw a rod. So by the time I packed up my tools, it was well past 11, and the prairie was silver under a nearly full moon. I decided to take the longer route home across the salt flats, thinking I'd enjoy the open space and cool breeze, and maybe clear my head from the stink of motor oil. There's something peaceful about those white stretches under moonlight, looking like a frozen lake, even though you can taste the salt on the wind. But that night, the quiet felt off somehow, like there was weight behind it, pressing down on my chest. I was cruising about 40 when I noticed a dark shape, standing dead still, out on the flats, maybe 100 yards off the road. At first I figured it was just a cow from a busted fence or one of the wild mustangs folks sometimes spot around here. But as I eased the truck closer, my headlights swept across it, and I realized it was an animal I'd never seen before. It stood tall on 4 legs, fur a dusty gray color that almost blended into the salt. But its head seemed too big for its body, and its ears were long and pointed like a mule deer's. I slowed to a crawl, engine rumbling low, feeling the hairs on my forearms stand up. The animal didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stared at me with these wide, dark eyes that caught the moonlight like wet stones. A chill slipped under my shirt, and I rolled down my window, trying to convince myself it was just some weird-looking deer. I called out soft, "Hey there, boy," the way you'd talk to a skittish horse, but the animal tilted its head, and that's when I noticed the way its chest moved, like it was breathing too fast, shuddering almost, though its legs stayed stiff as fence posts. It made a sound then, low and hollow, a kind of groaning hum that vibrated through the metal of my door. My skin crawled, and my mind jumped to all the old stories people tell about spirits wandering the salt flats, lost souls from long before statehood. I kept telling myself not to be foolish, that this was Oklahoma, not some ghost story, but the longer I watched, the more the thing seemed to flicker around the edges, like heat mirage off blacktop. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, unable to tear my eyes away as it took a stiff, almost mechanical step forward. Suddenly, the creature let out another groaning noise and wheeled around, loping off across the salt with a strange, stuttering gait, its legs bending oddly like hinges working the wrong way. Dust puffed up behind it, and for a few seconds it looked like it was melting into the pale ground, its shape blurring, until it vanished into a shimmer of moonlight and haze. I sat there another minute, engine idling, trying to decide if I should follow it or just get the hell home. Eventually, I turned the truck around and headed back toward Cherokee, heart pounding so hard it felt like it might split my ribs. I kept checking the mirrors the whole way, half expecting it to reappear trotting behind me. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement again and saw the glow of town lights on the horizon. Next day I drove back out in daylight, thinking I'd find tracks, or at least scuff marks in the salt. But there wasn't a single sign anything had crossed that ground. Not hoof prints, not paw prints, nothing. Just flat white crust stretching in every direction under a hard blue sky. Folks say maybe it was just a sick deer or some animal twisted up by disease, but I can't shake the memory of those dark eyes fixed on me like they were full of questions or warnings. Since then I've kept my night drives closer to town, figuring there's plenty I don't need to see out there on the flats after dark. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw. The next tale's even stranger, if you're up for it. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I went to check the fence behind the barn over in Tillman County, figuring I'd patch a few spots where the wind had knocked boards loose the night before. My name's Henry, and I've run cattle out here near Frederick since I took over the place from my old man, who always said this land's beautiful, but full of tricks if you let your guard down. I'm 62 now, slower on the knees but still up before dawn, coffee in hand, keeping an eye on the horizon for storms or strays. That afternoon the sky was that hard, flat blue that comes after a cold front, with the wheat fields shining like gold under the sun. I took my toolbox and headed out past the barn, feeling the kind of quiet that only happens when the wind's finally calmed down. Usually that quiet makes me feel peaceful, but that day it felt tight, like the silence was watching me work. I'd just finished hammering the last nail when I heard something crunch through the dry grass off toward the creek, heavy and deliberate, like a big animal moving slow. I figured it was one of my steers that had gotten loose again, so I grabbed my hat and headed that way, cussing under my breath. As I got closer, the smell hit me first, musky and sour, like wet fur left too long in the sun. And that's when I realized the sound wasn't hooves, but something dragging. My boots sank a little in the soft creekside dirt, and the closer I got, the colder the air seemed to feel, though the sun was shining bright overhead. I rounded a stand of scrubby mesquite, and that's when I saw it, standing half in the shadows under the creek bank. It was a hog, or so I thought at first. Big, bristly, shoulders humped and snout rooting through the dirt. But its skin looked too pale, almost hairless, shining in places like it was wet. Its ears were longer and sharper than a normal hog's, and its eyes, when it lifted its head, were milky white, like old glass marbles. It stared straight at me, snuffling the air, and I felt this cold dread slide up my spine. I've seen feral hogs all my life, but never one that seemed to flicker around the edges like heat shimmering above a road. The thing grunted, low and deep, a noise so thick it seemed to push against my chest, and for a moment it seemed like it was deciding whether to charge or run. My hammer felt small and useless in my hand, and I stood there frozen, listening to my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then, as sudden as a door slamming, it spun around and plunged into the creek, water splashing high as it disappeared under the muddy surface. I ran up to the bank and scanned the water, expecting to see ripples or bubbles, but the creek was still and smooth, like glass. Not a single ring in the water, no rustling in the reeds, nothing. I stayed there a long minute, straining to hear so much as a twig snap, but all that met my ears was the distant caw of a crow overhead. When I finally turned back toward the barn, I felt like I was leaving something unfinished behind me. Like a question hanging in the air, I couldn't shake the idea that whatever that thing was, it wasn't just an ordinary animal, no matter what my brain kept insisting. The next morning, I went back with a rifle, just in case it was some sick hog that might come back causing trouble. But there were no tracks in the mud, No churned-up water, nothing except undisturbed creek banks and the faint smell of wet dirt. Neighbors laugh when I tell it, saying I must have been seeing reflections off the water or spooked by a half-wild pig. But I know what I saw, or what I thought I saw, and ever since I keep my eyes sharp near the creek after sundown. Sometimes, when the wind dies down, I swear I still hear that dragging sound moving through the grass. Anyway, let's go to the next one. Folks around here say the woods near Broken Bow hold things that ain't meant to be seen, but I'd never put much stock in talk like that until one night last November changed my mind. My name's Carly, and I've been driving a lumber truck for the past 12 years, hauling pine and oak from the sawmills to the yards all over McCurtain County. I'm used to long nights behind the wheel, headlights bouncing off tree trunks and the smell of pine sap hanging heavy in the cab. That evening, I'd finished my last delivery late and decided to cut through a service road that winds past a thick stand of timber, hoping to shave off a few miles on my way home. The moon was up, but half hidden behind clouds, casting everything in a soft, silvery gloom, and the air smelled cold and damp, like wet leaves and distant rain. Usually, I find that kind of drive peaceful, but from the second I turned off the highway, I felt like someone was following alongside the truck, keeping perfect pace in the dark. About a mile in, I saw something dart across the road in front of my high beams. A quick dark flash so fast I barely caught the shape. I braked hard enough that my load shifted and rattled, my heart beating like a hammer in my chest. I sat there a minute, scanning the trees, telling myself it was probably a deer or maybe a big raccoon spooked by my lights. But as I rolled forward again, I spotted it crouched at the tree line. A creature about the size of a large dog, its fur a patchy reddish-brown, mottled with dark streaks like old blood. Its eyes glowed yellow, reflecting my lights, and they seemed fixed on me with a look that was too intent, too knowing. I've seen plenty of wildlife on these roads, but I'd never felt an animal looking at me like it was weighing its options, deciding whether to approach. I shifted the truck into park and leaned forward, trying to get a better look. The creature's shoulders were high and sharp, almost like a hyena's, and its muzzle was long but strangely narrow, tapering into a point. It made this low chuffing sound that sent goosebumps crawling up my arms, and though I kept telling myself it had to be some mangy coyote, deep down I felt like I was staring at something pretending to be a coyote. It shuffled a few steps closer, its movements jerky, as though it couldn't quite figure out how to walk right. And for a few seconds, it stood there panting, tongue lolling out of its mouth. But its tongue was pale, almost gray, and seemed too long, swinging low enough to brush the leaves. My breath fogged up the windshield as I whispered, "Go on, get," though my voice didn't sound like my own. All of a sudden it threw its head back and let out a yipping cry that echoed through the trees, so sharp and high it hurt my ears. Then it turned and slipped into the undergrowth without a sound, vanishing as if the darkness swallowed it whole. I climbed down from the cab and shone my flashlight around, but all I could see were pine needles and leaf litter, no broken branches or prints in the soft dirt. The air felt heavy, pressing against my skin, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I thought about following the creature deeper into the trees, but my gut screamed at me to leave well enough alone. So I climbed back into the truck and kept driving, my hands trembling on the wheel, scanning every patch of shadow until I finally hit the lights of town. Next morning, I checked the spot in daylight, hoping to find tracks or scat. But there was nothing, not even a bent twig to show where the animal had been. Folks at the mill laughed and said it was probably a sick dog, but I can't forget those yellow eyes, or how that thing seemed almost embarrassed in its own skin, like it didn't quite belong in this world. Now I keep my routes on the main highway after dark, figuring a few extra miles is a small price to pay for peace of mind. This was nothing compared to what's coming up. Some say the next story might keep you awake tonight. Back in the summer of 2004, when the days seemed hot enough to fry an egg on a mailbox, I was working irrigation on a melon farm outside Hinton, right on the edge of where the prairie rolls into red clay hills. My name's Walt, and I've been running farm equipment since I was 16, usually before the sun comes up and long after it's gone down again. I'd been out checking drip lines late that night because one of the pumps was acting up, and the boss wanted every drop of water counted for. The moon was high, painting the fields in silver stripes, and the smell of warm earth and sweet melon vines hung thick in the air. I'd always loved working nights, when the tractors were quiet, and the only sound was the wind moving through the rows. But that particular night, the silence felt off, as though something was hiding just beneath it, waiting. I'd parked the gator by the pump house and was halfway through fixing a cracked valve when I heard a sharp, wet splash coming from one of the irrigation ditches a few rows over. I figured it was just a raccoon, or maybe a possum hunting frogs, though it sounded heavier than either of those critters ought to be. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked toward the noise. Flashlight cutting through the shadows, my boots sinking into the soft, wet dirt between melon hills. The closer I got, the louder the splashing became, rhythmic and slow, like something deliberately stirring the water. I tried to tell myself it was just some animal having a midnight swim, but a part of me felt my chest tightening, and I started wishing I'd stayed back at the pump house. When I reached the ditch, I stopped cold. There in the water stood what I first thought was a huge beaver, its slick fur glistening under my light. But it was far too big, easily waist-high on me, and the shape of its body wasn't right. It stood up on two hind legs, hunched forward, shoulders rolling like a bear's, but with a flat, paddle-shaped tail slapping lightly against the water. Its eyes reflected red in my beam, and when it turned its head toward me, I saw a broad, flat snout that seemed almost human for a split second, like a face peering out from behind an animal mask. It made a low, huffing noise, breath steaming in the cool night air, and I felt my legs go weak, as if the dirt was shifting under my feet. I've faced down angry bulls and rattlers, but nothing ever made me feel the way I did looking at that thing. The creature stared at me a few seconds longer, then dropped back to all fours and moved off through the ditch, the water barely rippling as it passed. I shone my flashlight along the bank, but the creature was already gone, leaving only the smell of wet mud and something else, like fish left out in the sun. I stood there, shaking, trying to convince myself it was a sick beaver, some freak of nature. But the way it moved, and the way it looked right into my eyes, left me feeling like I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. I made my way back to the gator as fast as my boots would carry me, feeling like shadows were crowding close, pressing in on all sides. Next morning I checked for tracks, but found only churned mud and flattened grass. I tried telling my foreman about it, but he just laughed and said I'd been breathing too many diesel fumes. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was nothing but a big, misshapen beaver. Still, I've avoided that section of ditch ever since, especially after dark, because deep down, I'm not convinced that thing was any ordinary animal. Sometimes, when the sprinklers hiss across the fields at night, I swear I hear something else moving through the vines. Anyway, let's go to the next one. Yeah. My name's Sherry, and I've been the rural mail carrier around Washita County for nearly 20 years, winding through gravel roads and open fields where the only company some days is a hawk circling overhead. Folks think delivering mail is dull work, but I've learned that the back roads hold plenty of strange sights if you're out there often enough. One crisp morning last October, the sky streaked pink and orange over the harvested cotton fields, and I'd just finished the first half of my route. I was taking the dirt track along a stretch of scrubby cedar and blackjack oaks, humming along to Patsy Cline on my radio. Normally I love that part of my run because it's peaceful, and the sunlight filters through the branches like stained glass. But that morning, something about the hush in the air felt too heavy, like the land was holding its breath. I came around a bend and braked hard when I saw something big sprawled across the road ahead, blocking both tracks. At first, I thought it was a calf that had gotten loose, but as I inched closer, I realized it was an armadillo. Only it was the biggest armadillo I'd ever laid eyes on, easily the size of a medium dog, its shell pale gray and mottled with pale patches that almost looked like scars. It wasn't moving, but its front claws were flexing in the dirt like it was getting ready to dig. I rolled my window down and called out softly, half expecting it to scuttle off like they always do. Instead, it slowly lifted its head and fixed me with black, beady eyes that seemed far too bright in the morning sun. A shiver went through me as I realized how deliberate that stare felt, like it was studying me the same way I was studying it. I eased the Jeep closer, tires crunching gravel, but the creature didn't flinch or curl up into a ball. Its shell seemed to ripple, bending almost like soft plastic, and for a second, it looked like something was shifting underneath the plates, like muscles or something else trying to push free. The sun caught its surface and made it shimmer faintly, almost like a heat haze, and I felt my stomach flip. I'd seen plenty of armadillos crushed on highways or scurrying through roadside grass, but never one that seemed to swell and contract, like it was breathing too deeply. Then it let out a low grunting sound. Not the squeaks or hisses they sometimes make, but a drawn-out, almost guttural moan that made the hair stand up on my neck. I froze, one foot hovering over the gas pedal, torn between curiosity and the urge to gun it in reverse. Then, without warning, it lurched upright onto its hind legs, balancing in a way no armadillo should. Its front claws dangled awkwardly, and it stood there a moment, swaying side to side, as if trying to keep its balance. I swear it was taller than my hood. My mouth went dry as dust, and I felt this overwhelming urge to look away, but I couldn't. The thing tilted its head as if sniffing the air, then slammed back down onto all fours so hard that dust puffed up around it. It spun and barreled into the brush, its shell crashing against branches with surprising force. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, listening to the brush shake and rustle as it disappeared deeper into the woods, leaving the road silent and empty behind it. Later that day, I circled back to the same spot, hoping to find tracks or even the flattened grass where it had been lying, but there was nothing. No prints, no drag marks, not a single sign that an animal the size of a dog had been sprawled across that road. Folks at the post office chuckle when I tell the story, saying I must have been sleep-deprived or spooked by a trick of the light. But I know what I saw, or at least what I think I saw, and I haven't driven that stretch of dirt road without glancing over my shoulder ever since. Now I always wonder what else might be out there, waiting in the shadows of the cedars. This was nothing compared to the next tale. Some folks say that one still echoes through the wheat fields at night. It was early May, right before the storms roll in and the wheat fields start waving like green oceans, and I was hauling a load of gravel to a job site near the edge of the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. My name's Rick, and I've driven dump trucks all across this state for over 2 decades, from dusty oil leases to new highway cuts, and I've seen my fair share of wildlife crossing the roads. But that morning the air felt different, heavy, almost buzzing, and I kept glancing at the horizon where the clouds were stacked up like bruises. I'd left Lawton before sunrise, thinking I'd beat the worst of the wind, but the breeze kept coming in hot and dry, rattling the loose panels on my rig. The highway was empty except for a few ranch trucks headed the other way, and the early light spilled gold over the low hills, making the granite boulders glow. I usually love this stretch, but that day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I was easing down an old service road near a dry creek bed when I spotted movement up ahead, low and quick across the gravel. I tapped the brakes, thinking it was a bobcat or maybe a big turkey darting off the road. But when I got closer, I realized it was a porcupine, only it wasn't moving right. It glided instead of waddling, and its quills shimmered in the light like thin threads of silver. I slowed to a crawl, my tires crunching on the gravel, trying to figure if it was sick or hurt. The creature stopped right in the middle of the road and turned toward me, quills rising and falling like tiny breathing reeds. Its eyes caught the sunlight and flashed a pale, icy blue, which sent a cold bolt straight through my chest. I'd never seen a porcupine's eyes look like that, and for a moment I felt like it was staring straight through my windshield into my thoughts. I put the truck in park and leaned forward, watching it sway side to side, quills rustling softly like wind through dry grass. Its face seemed longer than any porcupine I'd ever seen, and its nose was thin and almost pointed, twitching rapidly as if sniffing the air for my scent. Then it let out a low warbling sound that I've never heard come out of any animal, part bird call and part groan, echoing off the canyon walls around me. I reached for my phone, half wanting to film it, half afraid to move at all. The creature inched closer, its quills shimmering with an odd light, and I felt my pulse thudding in my temples so loud it drowned out the hum of my engine. For a second, it seemed like it was going to try to climb onto my truck, and I honestly didn't know what I'd do if it did. Suddenly, it dropped low, spun around, and raced off the road, moving impossibly fast for something built like a prickly barrel. It disappeared into the brush, leaving the leaves shaking and a faint metallic scent hanging in the air, like old pennies left in rainwater. I sat there for a good few minutes, staring at the empty road, half expecting it to pop back out again. When I finally drove on, I kept checking my side mirrors, convinced I'd see it trotting along the ditch behind me. I tried to tell myself it was just a porcupine with mange or some weird trick of the morning light, but deep down, I knew it wasn't anything normal. The way it looked at me, and the way it moved, felt like something wearing a porcupine's shape, not an animal at all. When I told the crew back at the gravel yard, they laughed and said I'd probably just worked one too many 14-hour days. Maybe they're right, but even now, every time I run a load past the Wichita foothills, I keep my eyes peeled for silver quills glinting in the brush. Part of me still wonders if it might come back, or if it's out there waiting for someone else to drive by slow enough to notice. To this day, I'm not sure what I saw, and maybe I don't want to know for certain. Thanks for sticking around and listening to these stories. It means a lot. If you enjoyed these strange tales from Oklahoma's backroads, don't forget to hit subscribe and check out the other videos on the channel. Who knows what else might be waiting out there, just beyond the headlights.